In 1844, authorities in Prussia seized a book, examined it, and then did something strange. They released it almost immediately, not because it was harmless, but because they deemed it too incomprehensible to threaten anyone. The book detonated like a bomb in the intellectual circles of Berlin anyway, provoking furious responses from nearly every major thinker of the time. Its author's name would be systematically erased, whispered about in private letters, avoided in public discourse for generations. Even his closest friends, who initially praised his brilliance, would later deny his influence, bury his contributions, and watch as his legacy disappeared into deliberate obscurity. This was Max Stirner, and his work challenged not just political systems or religious dogma, but the very foundation of how human beings think about themselves, their purpose, and their place in the world. Johann Caspar Schmidt, writing under the pseudonym Max Stirner, a nickname derived from his prominent forehead, produced one of the most explosive philosophical texts ever written. The book appeared in late 1844, although dated 1845 to evade censorship, and its title translates literally as the unique individual and their property, though it has been known in English as the ego and its own. What makes Stirner extraordinary is not merely what he argued, but how completely his work dismantled every intellectual system of his era. He did not attack religion from the standpoint of science, nor did he critique capitalism from a communist perspective. Instead, he revealed that all these positions, all these supposedly opposed worldviews, rested on the same fundamental error. They all demanded that the individual subordinate themselves to something beyond themselves, whether God, humanity, society, the state, or even reason itself. Stirner was a member of Die Freien, the Free, a group of radical young Hegelians who gathered at Hippel's wine bar in Berlin. This circle included names that would define 19th century thought: Bruno Bauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, Arnold Ruge, Friedrich Engels, and later Karl Marx. These were the intellectual revolutionaries of their time, the ones pushing German philosophy beyond Hegel's systematic idealism into new territories of materialism, atheism, and social critique. Yet when Stirner published his major work, he turned his critique against them too, against his own friends and collaborators. He argued that they had simply replaced one set of sacred abstractions with another. They had traded God for man, religion for humanism, and in doing so, had created new tyrannies as oppressive as the old ones. The reaction was volcanic. Marx and Engels devoted hundreds of pages to refuting him. Bruno Bauer felt personally betrayed. The book became the philosophical scandal of its generation, and then, somehow, it vanished. What follows is an exploration of Stirner's philosophy, its roots in the Hegelian tradition he sought to destroy, the various forms of egoism he articulated, and his strange, contested relationship with Friedrich Nietzsche, who came after him and seemed to echo his ideas while possibly never having read him. We will examine why this obscure schoolteacher from Berlin wrote something so radical that it still disturbs readers today, why his work was suppressed not by censors, but by silence, and what his philosophy means for anyone trying to understand the individual's place in a world that constantly demands submission to higher causes. Johann Caspar Schmidt was born in Bayreuth in 1806, and by the time he reached Berlin to study philosophy in the 1820s, He had already acquired the nickname that would define him. His schoolmates called him Stirner, derived from stern, the German word for forehead, because of his unusually prominent brow. He attended lectures by Hegel himself at the University of Berlin, though with limited academic success. After struggling through his exams, he found work teaching history and literature at a private girls' school while spending his evenings in the city's wine bars and cafes, where the real intellectual ferment was happening. To understand Stirner's eruption into philosophy, you need to understand the crisis that German thought had entered after Hegel's death in 1831. Hegel had constructed perhaps the most comprehensive philosophical system in history, one that claimed to explain everything from logic to history, from nature to the state. His dialectical method, moving through thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, promised to reveal the rational structure underlying all reality. More crucially, Hegel had proclaimed that history had reached its culmination in the modern Prussian state, that the rational had become real. For his immediate disciples, this was enormously satisfying. It meant they lived at the apex of human development, that philosophy had finally fulfilled its promise. But Hegel's death changed everything. History continued. The Prussian state revealed itself to be not the rational ideal, but an increasingly reactionary regime that crushed dissent and enforced censorship. This created a fundamental problem for Hegel's followers. If the system was supposed to be complete, if history had reached its end, then what explained the obvious gap between philosophical reason and social reality? The Hegelian school fractured into three camps. The right Hegelians defended orthodoxy, arguing that Hegel's philosophy vindicated both Christianity and the conservative politics of the Restoration period following Napoleon's defeat. They taught in universities, held prestigious chairs, and worked to reconcile Hegelian idealism with evangelical theology and state authority. The left Hegelians, also called the young Hegelians, took the opposite path. They seized on Hegel's dialectical method as a principle of movement, a tool for revolutionary change. If reason was to be real, then existing reality must be transformed to match rational principles. This group, active from the late 1830s through the mid 1840s, included some of the most radical minds of the century. David Strauss published The Life of Jesus in 1835, treating the Gospels as mythological expressions of early Christian consciousness rather than historical fact. This provoked the split that would define the movement. Ludwig Feuerbach argued in The Essence of Christianity that God was merely a projection of humanity's own alienated essence, that religion was anthropology in disguise. Bruno Bauer developed a philosophy of infinite self-consciousness and criticism, a kind of aristocratic intellectualism that scorned both the state and the masses. Arnold Ruge edited journals that became organs of radical political opposition. These young Hegelians transformed German philosophy from an academic discipline into a revolutionary practice. They moved from analyzing religion to critiquing politics and economics, laying the groundwork for socialism and Marxism. They gathered in Berlin, particularly at the university, but also in more informal settings. And this is where Stirner enters. By the early 1840s, a core group of young Hegelians, calling themselves Die Freien, the Free, met regularly at Hippel's wine bar on Friedrichstrasse in Berlin. This was not an organization, but an informal society open to anyone dissatisfied with existing conditions and willing to articulate sharp criticism. The membership fluctuated. Visitors came and went, but the core included Bruno Bauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, Arnold Ruge, and later Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Stirner was a regular attendee, a quiet presence who apparently contributed little to the heated debates, but listened intently. Engels later recalled that he and Stirner were close friends, and one of the few visual records we have of Stirner is a caricature drawn by Engels himself. Marx may or may not have met Stirner personally. The historical record is unclear, but he certainly knew of him through the circle. Die Freien cultivated a bohemian, confrontational style. They drank heavily, argued late into the night, and became notorious for their extreme atheism and abstract radicalism. Their meetings were even monitored by secret police, as shown in Engels' own drawings of the gatherings. The group existed in a specific historical moment of crisis and possibility. Prussia in the early 1840s was a pressure cooker. The regime of Friedrich Wilhelm III and later Friedrich Wilhelm IV responded to the radical intellectuals with systematic repression. In 1841, the government brought the aged philosopher Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling to Berlin explicitly to root out what they called the dragon seed of Hegelianism. Bruno Bauer was dismissed from his teaching post at the University of Bonn in 1842, a decisive event that radicalized the entire movement. The Rheinische Zeitung, a liberal newspaper that Marx edited and to which young Hegelians contributed, was suppressed by Prussian authorities in March 1843. Censorship intensified. Academic positions disappeared. The young Hegelians found themselves deprived of platforms, jobless intellectuals on the margins of society. This marginalization produced two responses. Some, like Marx and Moses Hess, began to look abroad, seeking to continue the struggle from exile. They also started shifting their focus from purely philosophical critique to material economic analysis, moving toward what would become communism. Others, particularly the Berlin Free, reacted by adopting even more extreme theoretical positions. Deprived of practical outlets for their ideas, they doubled down on the power of pure criticism and abstraction. The apocalyptic fervor intensified. They believed themselves to be heralds of an inevitable revolution that would destroy the existing order and bring about the true end of history, not in a Prussian state, but in rational human emancipation. Into this fevered atmosphere, Stirner was quietly preparing his intervention. In late 1844, with the movement fragmenting and its members bitterly divided, he published The Ego and Its Own, or more accurately, The Unique Individual and Their Property. The book came as a shock, not just to the authorities, but to his own comrades. It was more radical than anything yet produced, and crucially, it turned the weapons of young Hegelian criticism against the young Hegelians themselves. Where they had attacked Christianity, Stirner attacked their humanism. Where they had demolished the concept of God, he demolished their concept of man. Where they preached revolutionary transformation in the name of universal principles, he preached something far stranger: the absolute sovereignty of the unique individual, owing nothing to any higher cause, any abstraction, any collective ideal whatsoever. The Ego and Its Own begins with a statement that could easily be mistaken for nihilism. but is something far more complex. Stirner writes that he has based his affair on nothing. This is not a confession of meaninglessness, but a declaration of independence from all foundations, all systems, all purposes beyond the self. The book is divided into two major parts. The first, titled simply Humanity, is a destructive tour through human history and thought, demonstrating how every stage of civilization has created new forms of tyranny over the individual. The second part, titled I, is the constructive vision. Though construction is perhaps the wrong word, it is more accurately an assertion, a defiant proclamation of what Stirner calls the unique one, der Einzig, and its property. Der Einzige is nearly impossible to translate precisely into English. The word has been rendered as the ego, the self, the unique, the only one, the individual. Each translation captures something but loses something else. Einzige suggests absolute uniqueness, incomparability, something that cannot be reduced to a category or concept. It is not the ego in the Freudian sense, not a psychological structure. It is not the self in the philosophical sense, not an essence that can be defined. It is you, right now, in your irreducible particularity, in your concrete existence that cannot be captured by any abstraction. Stirner insists that the unique one cannot even be properly spoken of, because to name it is already to place it in a category, to make it something general. He writes that names do not name it. The unique one is what remains after all concepts, all identities, all categories have been stripped away. This might sound mystical, and indeed there is something almost Zen-like in Stirner's insistence on the unnameable nature of the self. But he arrives at this position through relentless logic, not mysticism. His method is to take every concept that claims authority over the individual and show that it is what he calls a spook, a phantom, a fixed idea. The German word is spook, which carries connotations of haunting, of ghostly possession. These spooks are not simply false beliefs or illusions. They are ideas that have been elevated to the status of the sacred, ideas that demand submission, ideas that possess individuals and make them act against their own interests in service to something external. God is the most obvious spook. Christianity teaches that the divine is beyond human understanding, that it is sacred, untouchable, that it must be obeyed absolutely. Stirner's critique of religion is not that it is false in some empirical sense. His critique is that it alienates individuals from themselves, makes them servants of an abstraction. The religious person subordinates their will, their desires, their judgment to the supposed will of God. They sacrifice themselves for something that does not exist except as an idea in their own mind. But the brilliance and the scandal of Stirner's book is that he does not stop with God. He turns the same analysis on the concepts his fellow young Hegelians had championed. They had attacked religion in the name of man, in the name of humanity. Ludwig Feuerbach had written that God is merely a projection of human essence, that theology is really anthropology, that what we call divine attributes are actually human attributes we have alienated from ourselves. The solution, according to Feuerbach, was to recognize this, to reclaim these attributes, to place humanity rather than God at the center. But Stirner saw that this was simply replacing one spook with another. Humanity, with a capital H, is just as much an abstraction as God. It is just as external to the individual, just as demanding of sacrifice and submission. When you are told to act for the good of humanity, to subordinate your interests to the interests of the human species, you are being asked to worship a new deity. Man has replaced God, but the structure of domination remains identical. The same applies to all the political and social ideals that the radicals of Stirner's time championed. Liberty, equality, fraternity, these were the watchwords of the revolution. But what is liberty? It is an abstraction, an idea that exists nowhere except in human minds. Yet it demands that real, concrete individuals sacrifice themselves for its realization. People die for liberty, suffer for liberty, and in doing so, they prove that they are not free. They are possessed by the idea of freedom. Stirner writes that freedom is actually an impossible demand. It always requires freedom from something, which means it is always defined by what it opposes. You can never be simply free, only free from this or that constraint. But each liberation creates new dependencies, new authorities. Free yourself from God, and you become subject to reason. Free yourself from the church, and you become subject to the state. Free yourself from monarchy, and you become subject to the people. The individual is never actually liberated, merely transferred from one master to another. The concept of society is another spook. We are told constantly that we live in society, that society has needs and interests, that we must fulfill our social obligations. But what is society? Where does it exist? You cannot point to it. You can point to individual human beings, to their interactions, to institutions they have created. But society, as such, as an entity with its own existence and its own demands, is a phantom. Yet this phantom exercises tremendous power. People curtail their desires, suppress their individuality, obey laws they despise, all because society supposedly requires it. Stirner's response is stark. Society does not exist. Only individuals exist. And any association of individuals that demands subordination of the individual to the collective is simply a new form of tyranny. Even morality, the bedrock of ethical life, is exposed as a spook. Morality claims to articulate universal principles, binding on all rational beings. Whether derived from God, from reason, from human nature, or from social utility, moral principles present themselves as objective, as existing independent of any individual's will or desire. Stirner argues that this objectivity is the mechanism of oppression. When you internalize moral principles, when you feel guilt for violating them, when you act against your own interests because a principle demands it, you have been possessed. You are no longer acting from yourself, but from an alien power that has set up residence in your consciousness. The moral individual is a divided individual, constantly in conflict between what they want and what they ought to do. Stirner's egoist rejects this division entirely. There is no ought. There is only what I want, what serves my interests, what pleases me. This is where Stirner's philosophy becomes genuinely unsettling, even for those sympathetic to his critique of religion and authority. He is not advocating for a different set of moral principles, better principles, principles based on reason or human nature or social utility. He is rejecting morality as such. He writes that the egoist is neither moral nor immoral, but amoral. Morality simply has no purchase on someone who has recognized its illusory nature. This does not mean the egoist is a monster, randomly inflicting harm. It means the egoist acts from self-interest, which may include cooperation, affection, generosity, all the things we associate with moral behavior, but for entirely different reasons. You help someone not because you ought to, not because it is the right thing to do, but because you want to, because it pleases you, because that person is valuable to you. The moment it stops pleasing you, you stop. Stirner introduces the concept he calls ownness, Eigenheit in German. This is distinct from selfishness in the ordinary sense. Ownness is not about pursuing crude material self-interest or sensual gratification. It is about being the owner of yourself, of your thoughts, your desires, your actions, your world. It is the opposite of being owned. Most people, Stirner argues, are owned by ideas. They are owned by morality, by duty, by ideals, by causes they have made sacred. The egoist who has achieved ownness owns even their own thoughts. They do not serve truth. They use it. They do not serve reason. They employ it. They do not serve freedom. They exercise power. Ownness is a state of radical autonomy where nothing is sacred. Nothing is beyond appropriation. Nothing can claim authority over the individual. This leads to Stirner's concept of property, which is also radically redefined. Property for Stirner is not a legal right guaranteed by the state. He is scornful of bourgeois property rights, which depend entirely on state enforcement and, therefore, prove that private property owners do not truly own anything. They possess things only through the grace of law. Real property, egoistic property, is based on might, on power. What you can take, what you can hold, what you can use, that is yours. Not because you have a right to it, rights being yet another spook, but because you have the power to make it yours. This is not a defense of capitalism. Stirner is equally contemptuous of socialist proposals to abolish private property in favor of collective ownership. Collective property is just another way of ensuring that individuals do not own things. That property belongs to an abstraction called society or the people. The egoist takes what they can, uses what they need, without regard for either private or collective rights. How then do individuals relate to each other in Stirner's vision? He proposes what he calls the union of egoists, a voluntary association formed purely for mutual advantage. This is distinct from society, which is an organic whole that claims priority over its members. The union of egoists is a temporary alliance of individuals who recognize that cooperation can serve their interests better than isolation. It has no constitution, no binding rules, no collective identity. Members remain in the union only as long as it benefits them and leave the moment it does not. There is no loyalty to the union as such, no duty to other members beyond what serves one's own interests. This might sound like a formula for chaos, for the war of all against all. But Stirner argues that it is actually the only basis for genuine freedom. When people associate out of self-interest rather than duty or moral obligation, when they remain only as long as the association serves them, they retain their autonomy. They are not subordinated to the collective. They use the collective for their own ends. Stirner's most radical claim is that the individual is a creative nothing. He writes that he is not nothing in the sense of emptiness, but the creative nothing, the nothing out of which he creates everything. This idea draws on a complex philosophical tradition, but inverts it entirely. In Hegel's system, the individual moves through stages toward the realization of universal reason. The individual is a moment in the development of spirit. Stirner reverses this. There is no universal reason, no spirit, no development toward a rational end. There is only the individual who is nothing because they are not defined by any essence, any nature, any category. But this nothingness is creative. From this void, the egoist generates their own meanings, their own values, their own world. They are not discovering truth, but creating it. They're not realizing their essence, but refusing to have one. This philosophy provoked immediate and intense reactions. Ludwig Feuerbach felt personally attacked, as indeed he was. Stirner's critique of Feuerbach's humanism is devastating and occupies significant portions of the book. Bruno Bauer, Stirner's close friend, was deeply wounded by the sections targeting his philosophy of critical self-consciousness. Moses Hess wrote a rebuttal calling Stirner's book the culmination of bourgeois individualism. But the most consequential response came from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They devoted over 300 pages of manuscript to refuting Stirner in a work called The German Ideology. Most of this manuscript consists of line-by-line attacks on the ego and its own, mocking Stirner's style, dismissing his arguments, and attempting to demonstrate that his egoism is simply another idealist abstraction. Marx argued that Stirner's unique one is itself a spook, a reified concept that ignores the material conditions that actually shape individuals. For Marx, Stirner's philosophy was the dead end of young Hegelianism, the final implosion of German idealism into solipsistic fantasy. Yet the very length and vehemence of Marx's response suggests that he took Stirner seriously as a threat. And indeed, there is something in Stirner's philosophy that strikes at the heart of Marxism. If all collective identities are spooks, if humanity is an abstraction, if class consciousness is just another form of possession by an idea, then the entire project of communist revolution becomes questionable. Why should the individual sacrifice themselves for the proletariat, for the revolution, for the future classless society? These are all abstractions demanding submission. Stirner's philosophy offers no basis for collective political action, no justification for revolutionary struggle, no hope for social transformation. It is, in a sense, the most radical individualism imaginable, and therefore the most corrosive to any politics based on collective identity or solidarity. The book's reception outside the young Hegelian circles was limited. It sold poorly. Stirner was never able to capitalize on whatever notoriety it brought him. He attempted a sequel, a philosophical response to his critics, but it attracted little attention. He died in poverty and obscurity in 1856. His book was largely forgotten for decades, becoming a kind of secret knowledge passed among a few anarchist and individualist radicals. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that Stirner's work began to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and recognized as one of the most challenging texts in the history of philosophy. The question that haunts readers of the ego and its own is whether Stirner's philosophy is liberating or monstrous. Does it free the individual from oppressive illusions, or does it destroy the possibility of ethics, community, and meaning? The answer may be that it does both, that Stirner's unique one is genuinely free precisely because it refuses all consolations, all securities, all foundations. It stands alone in a world stripped of sacred meaning, creating itself moment by moment, owing nothing to anything beyond itself. Understanding Stirner requires distinguishing his particular form of egoism from other varieties of self-interested philosophy. The philosophical tradition recognizes several distinct types of egoism, each making different claims about the relationship between the individual and their interests. Psychological egoism claims that humans are by nature incapable of acting from any motive other than self-interest. Ethical egoism prescribes that individuals ought to pursue their own interests. Rational egoism asserts that it is rational to pursue self-interest. Stirner's position cannot be easily classified within these categories, and understanding why reveals the radical nature of his thought. Psychological egoism is a descriptive theory about human motivation. It claims that all human actions, regardless of how they appear, are ultimately motivated by self-interest. When someone helps a stranger, the psychological egoist argues, they are actually satisfying their own desire to feel good, to avoid guilt, or to gain social approval. Even the most apparently altruistic actions are really disguised forms of self-gratification. This theory has ancient roots, appearing in various forms in Greek philosophy, and it remains popular in certain strands of economics and evolutionary psychology. The difficulty with psychological egoism is that it becomes unfalsifiable. If every action can be reinterpreted as self-interested, then the theory explains nothing. It becomes a tautology rather than a meaningful claim about motivation. Stirner is sometimes characterized as a psychological egoist because he writes that all actions, even apparently altruistic ones, serve the ego. He argues that someone who sacrifices themselves for a cause is still acting from their own interests, specifically their interest in serving the cause, in fulfilling their duty, in being moral. The person who dies for God or country does so because they want to, because it satisfies some deep need in them. There is a sense in which this is true. Even self-sacrifice involves a choice, and choices reflect what the chooser values. But Stirner's argument is more subtle than standard psychological egoism. He is not trying to unmask all behavior as secretly selfish. Rather, he is distinguishing between different kinds of self-interest. The crucial distinction is between the conscious egoist, who knows they act from their own interests and owns this fact, and the unconscious egoist, who believes they serve something higher than themselves, but is actually serving an internalized abstraction. The unconscious egoist is possessed by ideas. They think they act for God, for humanity, for justice, but these are phantoms that have colonized their consciousness. They are egoists in the sense that they act from desires and needs, but they do not recognize these as their own. They have alienated their desires by projecting them onto external authorities. The conscious egoist, by contrast, has dispelled these phantoms. They recognize that their actions serve their own interests and no one else's. This does not mean they act cruelly or destructively. It means they act without illusions. If they help someone, they do so because helping pleases them, not because morality demands it. If they cooperate with others, they do so because cooperation serves their purposes, not because society requires it. This brings us to ethical egoism, which is a normative theory claiming that individuals ought to pursue their own interests. Unlike psychological egoism, which describes what people inevitably do, ethical egoism prescribes what people should do. It says you have no moral obligation to sacrifice your interests for others. that your own well-being is the proper standard of value. This position has been defended by various philosophers, often in service of justifying market economies where individual self-interest supposedly produces collective prosperity. Ayn Rand, the 20th century novelist and philosopher, developed perhaps the most systematic defense of ethical egoism, arguing that altruism is a destructive moral code that undermines human flourishing. The question is whether Stirner endorses ethical egoism. At first glance, it seems he must. He clearly rejects altruism, scorns self-sacrifice, and celebrates individual self-assertion. But ethical egoism still operates within the framework of morality. It replaces one moral code with another. It says you ought to pursue your self-interest, which means it posits an obligation, a duty, a norm that stands above the individual and judges their actions. This is precisely what Stirner rejects. He does not say you ought to be an egoist. He says you are an egoist, whether you realize it or not. And the question is whether you will be a conscious or unconscious one. He is not prescribing egoism as a moral ideal. He is describing a way of being that has moved beyond morality entirely. Consider Stirner's attitude toward rights. Ethical egoism often defends individual rights as necessary protections for self-interested action. You have a right to your life, your liberty, your property, and these rights allow you to pursue your interests without interference. But Stirner has no use for rights. Rights are legal fictions, abstractions that depend on state enforcement and collective agreement. The egoist does not have rights. The egoist has power. What you can take, what you can hold, what you can use, that is yours. Not because you have a right to it, but because you have the might to possess it. This is not a moral position. It is an amoral recognition of reality, stripped of its justifying illusions. Rational egoism claims that it is rational to pursue self-interest. This version of egoism grounds itself in reason rather than moral obligation. The rational egoist calculates what serves their interests and acts accordingly. This might include cooperation, honesty, and other seemingly moral behaviors, but only insofar as they produce beneficial outcomes for the agent. If lying serves your interests better than honesty, the rational egoist lies. There is no appeal to duty or virtue, only to rational calculation of consequences. This position appears in various economic theories that model humans as rational utility maximizers. Stirner's relationship to rational egoism is complex. He certainly advocates pursuing your interests, and he is scornful of irrational self-sacrifice for abstract causes. But he also rejects reason with a capital R as another tyrannical abstraction. When rationalists speak of reason, they typically mean some universal faculty that operates the same way in all people and produces objective conclusions about what should be done. Stirner denies that any such faculty exists. Reason, like morality, is a spook. It claims authority over the individual, telling them what they must think, what conclusions they must draw, what actions they must perform. The egoist uses reason as a tool, employs logic when it serves their purposes, but does not submit to reason as a master. Your thinking is yours, not the property of some universal rationality. This brings us to what might be called radical egoism, though Stirner himself did not use this term. Radical egoism is the position that the individual, the unique one, is the only reality and the only value. Everything else, all abstractions, All collective identities, all moral principles, all claims to authority are unreal. They have power only insofar as individuals grant them power by believing in them. The radical egoist recognizes this and withdraws all allegiance from these phantoms. This is radical in the etymological sense of going to the root. It cuts beneath all social conventions, all inherited values, all systems of thought, down to the bare fact of individual existence. From this foundation, or rather from this absence of foundation, the egoist creates their own meanings, their own values, their own world. Radical egoism is sometimes confused with solipsism, the philosophical position that only the self exists and all else is illusion. But Stirner is not a solipsist. He does not deny the existence of other people or the external world. He denies that these have any inherent claim on him, any right to demand his submission. Other people exist, but they exist as other unique ones, equally sovereign, equally unconstrained by moral obligation. The world exists, but it exists as material for appropriation, not as something sacred that must be respected. The radical egoist does not live in a world of illusions, but in a world stripped of false significance. Anarchist egoism is the political expression of radical egoism. Anarchism traditionally opposes state authority, but most anarchist philosophies propose alternative forms of social organization to replace the state. Anarcho-communists envision a society based on voluntary cooperation and collective ownership. Anarcho-syndicalists advocate workers' control through union organization. Mutualists propose a system of voluntary exchange without state intervention. All these positions share the belief that some form of collective life is both necessary and desirable. They replace state authority with other forms of authority, whether the community, the union, or principles of reciprocity. Stirner's anarchism, if it can be called that, is different. He proposes the union of egoists, but this is not a society or an organization in any conventional sense. It is a temporary alliance of individuals who recognize that cooperation sometimes serves their interests better than isolation. The union has no constitution, no rules, no collective identity. It exists only as long as its members choose to maintain it, and each member remains free to leave at any moment. There is no loyalty to the union itself, no commitment to other members beyond what serves one's own purposes. This is anarchism without community, without solidarity, without any of the social bonds that most anarchists consider essential. This position horrified many anarchists. Peter Kropotkin, the theorist of anarchist communism, saw Stirner's egoism as a betrayal of anarchist principles. Anarchism, Kropotkin argued, is about mutual aid, about recognizing that human beings are social creatures who thrive through cooperation. Stirner's egoism atomizes society, destroys the possibility of collective action, and reduces human relations to instrumental calculations. The practical expression of anarchist egoism in movements like illegalism seemed to prove Kropotkin's point. Illegalism emerged in France, Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland in the early 20th century. Illegalists embraced crime as a lifestyle, justifying theft, robbery, and even violence through Stirnerian philosophy. They recognized only might, not right. If they could take something, it was theirs. If laws stood in their way, laws were merely expressions of state power and had no moral authority. Illegalism scandalized the anarchist movement. Even sympathetic observers worried that it gave anarchism a bad reputation and disgusted potential converts. The illegalists seem to confirm the worst stereotypes about anarchists as criminals and nihilists. Yet, from a Stirnerian perspective, illegalism was perfectly logical. If property is based on might rather than right, if laws have no legitimacy, if morality is a spook, then why not take what you can? The illegalists were simply acting out the implications of radical egoism in a society still dominated by legal and moral fictions. Their crimes were not moral acts, but amoral ones, expressions of individual will unbound by social constraints. Yet even illegalism may not represent authentic Stirnerian egoism. Stirner never advocated a particular lifestyle or course of action. He never told anyone what to do. His philosophy is descriptive and liberating rather than prescriptive. He describes the unique one and the nature of ownness, but each unique one must determine for themselves how to live. Some might find that cooperation and kindness serve their interests. Others might find that rebellion and transgression do. The point is not to follow a program, but to abandon all programs, to live without reference to any higher authority or principle. This makes Stirnerian egoism resistant to organization, to movement building, to any form of collective political action. It is a philosophy of radical individualism that undermines its own capacity to influence the world beyond individual conversions. The various forms of egoism thus represent different philosophical projects. Psychological egoism attempts to describe human motivation. Ethical egoism prescribes a moral code. Rational egoism grounds action in calculative reason. Radical egoism rejects all these frameworks and asserts the absolute primacy of the unique individual. Anarchist egoism applies this to political life, proposing a non-society of sovereign individuals bound by nothing except temporary mutual advantage. Each form has its critics and its defenders, but Stirner's version remains the most extreme, the most challenging, and the most difficult to categorize. It resists incorporation into any system, even a system of egoism, because systematization itself is another form of domination over the unique one who cannot be captured by concepts. What makes Stirner's egoism truly radical is not just its rejection of conventional morality, but its rejection of all foundational principles whatsoever. Most philosophers, even rebels and revolutionaries, want to establish new foundations to replace the old ones. They want to discover the true basis for ethics, the correct political system, the rational way to organize society. Stirner dismisses this entire project. There are no true bases, no correct systems, no rational ways that stand above individual will and desire. There is only you, the unique one, creating your own life in a world that has no inherent meaning except what you give it. This is a philosophy of absolute freedom, but it is freedom without comfort, without security, without any guarantee that it will lead anywhere worth going. It is freedom as vertigo, as standing alone in an empty universe, and deciding what, if anything, matters. To understand Stirner's philosophy requires grasping his complex relationship with Hegelian dialectics. He was not simply a Hegelian, nor was he simply an anti-Hegelian. His work represents both an extension of Hegelian method and its ultimate negation, a movement that takes Hegel's own principles to conclusions that destroy the entire system. This paradox lies at the heart of Stirner's intervention into young Hegelian debates, and it explains why his contemporaries found him both familiar and utterly alien. Hegel had constructed a philosophical system based on dialectical movement. The dialectic operates through negation, through contradiction. A concept contains within itself its own opposite, its negation. This negation is not simply destruction, but productive. Through the conflict between thesis and antithesis, a new synthesis emerges that preserves elements of both while transcending them. Hegel called this process Aufhebung, a German word meaning simultaneously to cancel, to preserve, and to elevate. The dialectic moves forward through these stages, each synthesis becoming a new thesis that generates its own antithesis, propelling thought toward increasingly comprehensive and concrete concepts. Crucially for Hegel, this dialectical movement was not merely a method that philosophers applied to reality. It was the structure of reality itself. The world is spirit, Geist, becoming conscious of itself through human history. All of human experience, all institutions, all conflicts are moments in this grand process by which spirit realizes its own nature. History has direction and purpose. It moves toward a final stage where spirit achieves absolute self-knowledge, where reason becomes fully actual, where the rational and the real coincide. In Hegel's own time, he believed this culmination had essentially been reached. The Prussian state represented the actualization of freedom. Philosophy had revealed the rational structure of reality, and humanity stood at the end of history. The young Hegelians inherited Hegel's dialectical method, but rejected his conservative conclusions. If history continues, if the present state is manifestly irrational, then the dialectic must still be working. The contradictions of contemporary society are not resolved but active. David Strauss applied dialectical critique to the Gospels, treating the stories of Jesus as mythological expressions of early Christian consciousness rather than literal history. Ludwig Feuerbach turned the dialectic against religion itself, arguing that God is merely alienated human essence. Humans project their own best qualities onto an imaginary divine being and then worship this projection, losing themselves in the process. The task of philosophy is to reverse this alienation, to bring humanity back to itself by recognizing that all divine attributes are really human ones. Bruno Bauer developed a philosophy of infinite self-consciousness. For Bauer, consciousness is essentially critical. It negates whatever is given, whatever is immediate, in order to grasp its true nature. This process of criticism is infinite because there is always more to negate, always deeper levels of illusion to expose. The rational individual achieves freedom through this relentless criticism, refusing to accept anything as fixed or final. Bauer's philosophy was aristocratic in temperament. He scorned the masses who remained trapped in immediacy and celebrated the critical thinker who stands apart from ordinary life, judging it from the standpoint of pure reason. Stirner studied all these thinkers. He attended Hegel's lectures in Berlin. He read Feuerbach and praised his critique of religion. He was close friends with Bruno Bauer and admired his uncompromising radicalism. Yet when Stirner wrote The Ego and Its Own, he turned the weapons of dialectical criticism against his teachers and friends. His critique was devastating precisely because it accepted the premises of young Hegelian thought and drew conclusions that none of them could stomach. The structure of Stirner's book deliberately mirrors Hegelian dialectic. It opens with a triadic scheme applied to individual life and to human history. Childhood is the stage of realism, where the child is absorbed in concrete things. Youth is the stage of idealism, where abstract thoughts become paramount. Maturity is the stage of egoism, where the individual achieves conscious possession of themselves. This same pattern applies to human history. Ancient civilization was realistic, focused on the physical world and concrete things. The modern age, inaugurated by Christianity, is idealistic, dominated by abstractions and spiritual concerns. The future will be egoistic, characterized by the conscious, unique one who has transcended all abstractions. This appears thoroughly Hegelian. It uses the triadic structure of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It treats history as a progressive development through stages. It locates the present as a transitional moment, moving toward a higher synthesis. Yet Stirner's use of this structure is ironic, almost parodic. Where Hegel saw history moving toward the realization of universal reason, Stirner sees it moving toward the assertion of radical particularity. Where Hegel's synthesis preserves and elevates earlier stages, Stirner's egoism simply discards them as illusions. The form is Hegelian, but the content destroys everything Hegel stood for. Stirner's critique of Feuerbach exemplifies this method. Feuerbach had argued that religion alienates human essence by projecting it onto God. Man creates God in his own image, then worships the image and forgets his own creative power. The solution, according to Feuerbach, is to recognize this projection, to take back what belongs to humanity, to replace theology with anthropology. Love, reason, will, all the attributes we ascribe to God, are really attributes of the human species. When we understand this, we can affirm humanity itself as the highest value, the proper object of our devotion. Stirner's response was simple and brutal. Feuerbach has not abolished religion. He has merely created a new religion, the religion of humanity. Man with a capital M, humanity as a universal essence, the species as an ideal. These are the new gods demanding worship. They are just as external to the individual, just as alienating, just as tyrannical as the Christian God ever was. When Feuerbach tells me to love humanity, to sacrifice my interests for the good of the species, to recognize my essence in universal human nature, he is asking me to subordinate myself to an abstraction. The abstraction has changed from God to man, but the structure of domination remains identical. Moreover, Stirner argued, Feuerbach's humanism rests on a profound error. There is no such thing as human essence or human nature. These are concepts, abstractions, universals. What actually exists are individual human beings, each unique, each different. When you speak of humanity, you are speaking of an idea in your mind, not of anything real. The idea may have power over you, may shape your behavior, may make you sacrifice yourself for the good of mankind. But this power is the power of a phantom, a spook that has possessed your consciousness. Stirner's critique of Bruno Bauer followed similar lines. Bauer's philosophy of infinite self-consciousness and pure criticism seemed radical. It refused all fixed dogmas, rejected all given authorities, maintained a stance of perpetual negation. But Stirner saw that Bauer had simply elevated consciousness itself, the activity of critical thinking, into a new absolute. The critical thinker submits to reason, to the demands of logical consistency, to the imperatives of rational thought. This is still submission. The ego that thinks is not free. It is possessed by thought, by reason, by the activity of consciousness itself. Bauer responded to Stirner's critique with pain and anger. He felt betrayed by someone he had considered a friend and ally. He wrote articles defending his position, arguing that Stirner had misunderstood the nature of criticism. But he also recognized the power of Stirner's argument. Decades later, Bauer was one of only 2 people to attend Stirner's funeral, a gesture that suggests a grudging respect for the man who had wounded him so deeply. The fundamental divergence between Stirner and all other young Hegelians concerns the status of universals. For Hegel and his followers, universals are real. Concepts like spirit, humanity, reason, freedom, these are not mere names, but actual realities that exist and develop through history. Individuals are moments or expressions of these universal realities. Your consciousness is a moment in the development of spirit. Your labor is a moment in the evolution of human essence. You matter because you participate in something universal, something that transcends your individual existence. Stirner reversed this entirely. Universals are phantoms. Only individuals exist. There is no spirit unfolding through history, no humanity realizing its essence, no reason achieving self-consciousness. These are ideas that individuals create and then mistake for realities. They have power only because people believe in them, grant them authority, allow them to shape behavior. The egoist recognizes that universals are empty, that concepts have no existence apart from the individuals who think them. Once you see this, once you grasp that all the grand abstractions are nothing but words and thoughts, they lose their power. You become the owner of your thoughts rather than being owned by them. This position cuts deeper than materialism. Marx would later argue that Hegel inverted reality by making spirit primary and matter secondary. That we need to turn Hegel on his head and recognize that material conditions determine consciousness, rather than consciousness determining material conditions. But even this materialist inversion preserves the Hegelian structure. It still posits universal forces, economic laws, historical development. Marx's materialism is dialectical. It sees history moving through stages driven by class conflict, ultimately toward a final resolution in communist society. The individual remains subordinate to these larger forces. Stirner rejected the entire framework. There is no dialectical movement of history because history is not a single process with a purpose. History is what individuals do, the actions of countless unique ones pursuing their own interests. There are no laws of history, no stages of development, no inevitable future. The present is not a moment in some grand narrative, but simply the current configuration of power, relations between individuals. The future is open, undetermined, created by the wills of those who have the power to shape it. This is why Stirner's philosophy cannot be adequately described as the culmination of Hegelianism, or its inversion or its negation. It is all of these and none of these. Stirner uses Hegelian concepts, employs dialectical reasoning, structures his argument according to Hegelian patterns. But he uses these tools to destroy the system from within. He takes the principle of negation, the refusal to accept anything as fixed or final, and applies it to negation itself. He takes the concept of alienation, the notion that humans lose themselves in external objects and ideas, and applies it to every concept the young Hegelians held sacred. He takes the demand for criticism, for radical questioning of all authority, and pushes it beyond any limit his contemporaries could accept. The result is a philosophy that stands outside the Hegelian tradition while being incomprehensible without it. Stirner's unique one is not a Hegelian concept because it cannot be conceptualized. It is not a moment in any dialectical development because it refuses to be part of any process beyond itself. It is not the realization of any essence because it has no essence to realize. Yet Stirner could only articulate this position by working through and against Hegelian philosophy, by using its own methods to reveal its limitations. The young Hegelians recognized that Stirner had done something unprecedented. Ludwig Feuerbach called him the most gifted and freest writer he had encountered. Arnold Ruge praised him as a theoretical liberator. Moses Hess attacked him as the embodiment of bourgeois individualism. Marx devoted hundreds of pages to refuting him. All acknowledged that Stirner posed a genuine threat, not to this or that doctrine, but to the entire project of philosophical radicalism as they understood it. If Stirner was right, if all universals were spooks and only the unique one existed, then political movements based on collective identities made no sense. Revolutionary transformation in the name of humanity or the proletariat or freedom was just another form of religious delusion. Philosophy itself, understood as the pursuit of universal truth, became impossible. This was unacceptable. The young Hegelians were committed to the possibility of rational social transformation. They believed philosophy could guide political action, that criticism could expose illusions and pave the way for genuine freedom. Stirner's egoism seemed to render all this pointless. It offered no basis for solidarity, no justification for collective struggle, no hope for a better future. It was, from their perspective, the end point of German idealism, the moment where philosophy consumed itself and left nothing but the isolated individual in a meaningless world. Yet from Stirner's perspective, this was precisely the liberation philosophy promised but could never deliver so long as it remained bound to abstractions. The young Hegelians wanted freedom, but could not achieve it because they kept creating new masters to replace the old ones. They rejected God only to embrace humanity. They attacked religious dogma only to defend rational dogma. They criticized the state only to propose new forms of collective authority. Stirner's message was stark. Stop serving abstractions. Stop sacrificing yourself for causes. Stop looking for meaning in universal principles. Recognize that you are unique, that no concept captures you, that your life is yours alone. This is not nihilism. It is the only genuine freedom. It is what remains when all the comforting illusions have been stripped away and you stand alone, conscious of your own power and your own finitude, creating your own meaning in a world that offers none. The relationship between Stirner and Nietzsche represents one of philosophy's most intriguing mysteries. Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844, the same year Stirner's book appeared, developed ideas that seemed to echo Stirner's with uncanny precision. Both declared the death of God and the bankruptcy of conventional morality. Both attacked humanistic abstractions and championed individual self-overcoming. Both wrote in aphoristic, provocative styles that defied academic convention. The similarities are so striking that observers have debated for over a century whether Nietzsche read Stirner, whether he was influenced by him, or whether the resemblance is pure coincidence. The question remains unresolved because Nietzsche never mentioned Stirner in any of his published works, letters, or notebooks that survive. The silence is either a damning indication of plagiarism or proof of independent development, depending on who you ask. The debate began almost as soon as Nietzsche became famous in the 1890s. Critics noticed the parallels and started asking questions. In 1904, Albert Levy published one of the first systematic studies comparing the two thinkers. He noted the absence of any reference to Stirner in Nietzsche's extensive writings and correspondence, which has remained the strongest argument against direct influence. However, it is certain that Nietzsche encountered Stirner's name and ideas in secondary sources. Friedrich Albert Lange's History of Materialism, published in 1866, discusses Stirner at length and compares his egoism with Schopenhauer's philosophy. Nietzsche read Lange's book carefully as a young man and was deeply influenced by it. Eduard von Hartmann's Philosophy of the Unconscious, published in 1869, also mentions Stirner prominently. Nietzsche knew this work as well and wrote against it. So Nietzsche was certainly aware of Stirner's existence and core ideas, even if he never read The Ego and Its Own directly. There is some circumstantial evidence suggesting Nietzsche may have read more than just these references. In 1874, a student of Nietzsche's at the University of Basel, named Adolf Baumgartner, borrowed Stirner's book from the university library. Baumgartner later claimed that Nietzsche had recommended it to him. Additionally, Ida Overbeck, wife of Nietzsche's close friend Franz Overbeck, reported a conversation where Nietzsche praised Stirner and expressed concern about being accused of plagiarism. According to her account, Nietzsche said he felt affinity with Stirner, but asked her to forget he had mentioned it, worried about accusations of copying. These testimonies suggest Nietzsche did read Stirner at some point, probably in the 1870s, but they are second-hand recollections recorded years after the fact and must be treated cautiously. The strongest argument against Stirner's influence on Nietzsche is not the absence of direct evidence, but the fundamental differences in their philosophical projects. Both thinkers criticized Christianity, morality, and abstractions, but they did so for different reasons and toward different ends. Stirner's philosophy is essentially negative and individualistic. He dismantles all claims to authority, all collective identities, all purposes beyond the individual, and leaves nothing in their place except the unique one in their radical isolation. His work offers no vision of what should replace the old order, no ideal to strive toward, no hope for transformation beyond individual liberation from spooks. It is a philosophy of absolute negation. Nietzsche's philosophy, by contrast, is deeply concerned with creation and affirmation. His critique of Christianity and morality is preparation for something new. When Nietzsche announced that God is dead, he saw this as a crisis that demanded a response. The death of God creates a moral void, and Nietzsche worried intensely about what would fill it. Would humanity descend into nihilism, passive resignation, and what he called the last man, comfortable but spiritually empty? Or could humanity rise to the challenge and create new values, new meanings, new forms of life? This is where the Übermensch enters, Nietzsche's vision of a transformed humanity that has overcome its current limitations. The Übermensch often translated as Superman or Overman, represents humanity's potential to transcend itself. Nietzsche introduced this concept in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published between 1883 and 1885. The Übermensch is not a political leader or a member of a master race, despite Nazi misappropriations of Nietzsche's ideas. It is an ideal of self overcoming, of creating one's own values, of affirming life in all its hardship and suffering. The Übermensch says yes to existence, transforms suffering into strength, and lives according to principles they have created for themselves rather than accepting inherited morality. Crucially, the Übermensch is oriented toward the future of humanity, not just individual satisfaction. Nietzsche writes that man is something to be overcome, that the Übermensch gives meaning to the earth, that this ideal justifies human existence. This is fundamentally incompatible with Stirner's philosophy. Stirner would see the Übermensch as another spook, another abstract ideal demanding submission. Why should the individual care about the future of humanity? Why should they strive to overcome themselves in service of some higher ideal? Humanity is an abstraction. The future is an abstraction. The Übermensch itself is an abstraction. For Stirner, all of these are phantoms that possess individuals and make them sacrifice their actual interests for imaginary purposes. The egoist does not serve humanity or work toward any collective transformation. The egoist takes what they want now, creates meaning for themselves alone, and owes nothing to any larger project. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power further distinguishes him from Stirner. Nietzsche saw will to power as the fundamental drive underlying all life. Living things do not simply seek survival or pleasure. They seek to expand, to grow, to overcome resistance, to impose their interpretation on the world. This will to power operates at every level, from biological organisms to social institutions to individual psychology. It is not merely about dominating others, though it can express itself that way. It is about the creative discharge of energy, the transformation of chaos into order, the imposition of form on matter. The Übermensch represents the highest expression of will to power, the individual who has organized the conflicting drives within themselves into a harmonious, powerful whole, and who uses this power creatively rather than destructively. Stirner has no comparable concept. His egoist simply pursues their interests without any underlying metaphysical principle explaining what those interests are or why pursuit matters. Stirner deliberately avoids constructing any system, any theory of human nature, any account of what drives behavior. These would all be abstractions, fixed ideas that constrain the unique one. The egoist is what they are, wants what they want, does what they do, and no theory captures this irreducible particularity. This refusal of systematization makes Stirner's philosophy philosophically frustrating, but also protects it from the kind of reification that turns concepts into new authorities. The divergence becomes clearest in their attitudes toward culture and creativity. Nietzsche was deeply concerned with art, music, literature, and the possibility of cultural renewal. He saw certain individuals, artists, and philosophers primarily as capable of creating new values and shaping civilization. His books are filled with discussions of Greek tragedy, Wagner's operas, the role of genius in history. The Übermensch is partly an aesthetic ideal, someone who crafts their life into a work of art, who imposes style and coherence on the chaos of existence. Nietzsche's philosophy aims at cultural transformation, at creating conditions where higher types can flourish and elevate humanity. Stirner shows little interest in any of this. He is not concerned with culture, with art, with the elevation of humanity. His egoist might appreciate these things if they provide pleasure, but there is no special status given to aesthetic creation or cultural achievement. The egoist is not trying to create anything lasting, not trying to influence future generations, not trying to leave a mark on history. They simply live, consume their world, and disappear. Where Nietzsche seeks meaning in creative achievement and cultural contribution, Stirner rejects meaning itself as another phantom. There is nothing to achieve, nothing to contribute to, nowhere to arrive. There is only the present moment and the unique one's experience of it. Their prose styles, while both unconventional, also differ significantly. Nietzsche writes with passionate intensity, with poetry, with a prophetic voice that seeks to transform readers. His books are performances, attempting to create the kind of individual they describe. He uses metaphor, myth, and music to reach beyond rational argument and affect readers emotionally and aesthetically. Stirner's prose is more argumentative, more systematic in its destruction, more relentlessly logical. He moves through positions, dismantling them one by one, showing how each supposed liberation creates new bondage. His style is sardonic, mocking, but also colder, more detached than Nietzsche's ecstatic proclamations. Several interpretations of the Stirner-Nietzsche relationship are possible. The first is that Nietzsche read Stirner, was influenced by him, and deliberately suppressed any acknowledgement to avoid accusations of plagiarism. This seems unlikely, given Nietzsche's generally honest engagement with his influences and his willingness to acknowledge debts to thinkers like Schopenhauer and Emerson. The second interpretation is that Nietzsche encountered Stirner's ideas through secondary sources, like Lange's book, found them interesting but undeveloped, and independently worked out similar positions. This is plausible, but leaves the remarkable similarities unexplained. The third, and perhaps most convincing interpretation, is that both thinkers arrived at similar conclusions because they faced the same philosophical crisis and applied similar methods. Both were responding to the collapse of religious authority and the failures of young Hegelian philosophy. Both saw that replacing God with abstract principles like humanity, reason, or progress merely created new forms of tyranny. Both applied radical criticism to every claim of authority and discovered that nothing could withstand this scrutiny. Given these shared starting points and methods, perhaps the similarities are inevitable rather than mysterious. As one scholar put it, the resemblances might reflect the inevitable logic of post-Hegelian philosophy pushed to its extreme. What remains striking is how Stirner has been overshadowed by Nietzsche in intellectual history. Nietzsche became one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, shaping existentialism, postmodernism, psychoanalysis, and countless cultural movements. Stirner remained obscure, known primarily to anarchists and specialists. Part of this is stylistic. Nietzsche is more readable, more quotable, more inspiring. Part is systematic. Nietzsche offers more to work with, more concepts to develop, more directions to explore. But part is surely ideological. Nietzsche's philosophy, for all its radicalism, can be interpreted in ways that serve collective projects, cultural movements, political ideologies. It has been appropriated by the left and the right, by artists and revolutionaries, precisely because it contains elements that transcend pure individualism. Stirner's philosophy resists appropriation. You cannot build a movement on radical egoism. You cannot create a culture around the rejection of all cultural authority. You cannot organize politically when organization itself is seen as submission to abstraction. Stirner's ideas are acid that dissolves everything, including attempts to use them for any purpose beyond individual liberation. This makes his philosophy philosophically purer than Nietzsche's, but also practically useless for anyone trying to change the world rather than simply understand it. The question of influence may ultimately be less important than the question of difference. Whether or not Nietzsche read Stirner, their philosophies diverge on crucial points. Stirner offers liberation from all idols, all abstractions, all purposes beyond the self, and accepts the isolation this entails. Nietzsche offers a path beyond nihilism through creative self-overcoming in service of an ideal that transcends the individual. One is a philosophy of absolute negation, the other of tragic affirmation. One destroys all meaning, the other attempts to create new meaning. One ends with the unique one, alone in an empty universe, the other with the Übermensch, giving meaning to the earth. They share a starting point in the critique of religion and conventional morality, but their destinations lie in opposite directions. Whether Nietzsche learned from Stirner or discovered these ideas independently, he ultimately rejected what Stirner represented: a philosophy that offers freedom but no purpose, autonomy but no direction, liberation but no hope. Stirner's influence unfolded through silence and erasure as much as through acknowledgement. His book created an immediate scandal when it appeared, but then vanished from intellectual discourse for decades. The pattern repeated throughout the 20th century. Thinkers read Stirner in their youth, were profoundly affected, and then either suppressed this influence or denied it entirely. This makes tracing his legacy peculiarly difficult. The evidence often consists of absences, of suspicious silences, of ideas that seem Stirnerian appearing in contexts where Stirner is never mentioned. The most consequential immediate response came from Karl Marx. In 1846, Marx and Engels began work on the German ideology, a massive manuscript intended to settle accounts with the young Hegelians. 3/4 of this work consisted of a section called St. Max, a line-by-line demolition of the ego and its own that stretched to over 300 pages. Marx's response was so lengthy and so vitriolic that it suggests genuine threat rather than mere dismissal. He mocked Stirner's style, ridiculed his arguments, and attempted to demonstrate that the unique one was itself a phantom, an abstraction that ignored material conditions. Marx argued that Stirner's egoism was the culmination of bourgeois ideology, the final dissolution of German idealism into solipsistic fantasy. Yet Marx's attack contained an implicit acknowledgement. He recognized that Stirner's philosophy struck at the heart of his own emerging materialism. If all collective identities are spooks, if class consciousness is just another fixed idea, if historical materialism itself is an abstraction demanding submission, then the entire communist project becomes questionable. Why should workers sacrifice themselves for the revolution for the proletariat, for the future classless society. These are all abstractions. Stirner's philosophy offered no basis for collective political action, no hope for social transformation through organized struggle. This made it, from Marx's perspective, politically useless and therefore requiring thorough refutation. The German ideology was never published during Marx's lifetime. It remained in manuscript form, left to the gnawing criticism of mice, as Marx himself put it. This meant that Marx's detailed engagement with Stirner never reached public attention during the crucial period when Marxism was developing as a movement. The manuscript was not published until 1932 by the Soviet Marx-Engels Institute. By then, Marxism was an established ideology, and Stirner had been rediscovered independently. The irony is profound. Marx devoted hundreds of pages to refuting a philosopher who had already been forgotten, and this refutation remained hidden until long after both thinkers were dead. Stirner's influence on anarchism developed through underground channels. In the late 19th century, the German writer John Henry Mackay discovered Stirner through Friedrich Albert Lang's History of Materialism. Mackay became obsessed. He spent years researching Stirner's life, tracking down documents, interviewing people who had known him. In 1898, Mackay published a biography that rescued Stirner from complete obscurity. He also promoted new editions of The Ego and Its Own, bringing it to the attention of a new generation of radical thinkers. This revival coincided with the flowering of individualist anarchism in Europe and America. Benjamin Tucker, who edited the influential anarchist journal Liberty in the United States, was among the first to recognize Stirner's importance. Tucker initially advocated natural rights philosophy, arguing that individuals had inherent rights to own the fruits of their labor. But in 1886, after reading Stirner, he abandoned natural rights entirely and converted to egoist anarchism. Tucker came to believe that only might exists, that rights are fictions, that property belongs to whoever has the power to take and hold it. This conversion was controversial. Natural rights advocates accused Tucker of destroying the philosophical foundations of anarchism. The debate became so bitter that some longtime contributors withdrew from Liberty in protest. Tucker published the first English translation of The Ego and Its Own, making it available to American audiences. His bookstore in New York, called the Unique Bookshop, in a deliberate reference to Stirner, became a gathering place for anarchists and freethinkers. Other American individualists adopted Stirnerian positions. James L. Walker published The Philosophy of Egoism in a journal called, appropriately, Egoism. Stephen Byington, who translated The Ego and Its Own, promoted Stirner's ideas through various anarchist publications. John Beverly Robinson wrote essays defending egoism against communist and socialist critics. In Europe, illegalism emerged as perhaps the most extreme practical application of Stirner's philosophy. Illegalists in France, Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland in the early 1900s embraced crime as a lifestyle justified by Stirnerian principles. They recognized only might, not right. If they could take something, it was theirs. If laws prohibited this, laws were merely expressions of state power with no moral authority. The illegalists scandalized even sympathetic anarchists. They seemed to confirm every negative stereotype about anarchism as criminal nihilism. Yet, from a Stirnerian perspective, their position was logically consistent. Why should the egoist respect property rights, which are spooks? Why should they obey laws they never consented to? The illegalists acted out what Stirner's philosophy implied, though whether he would have approved is unknowable. Stirner's influence extended beyond explicit political movements into broader intellectual currents. He is widely recognized as a forerunner of existentialism, though the connection is complex and often unacknowledged. Herbert Reed, the British art critic and anarchist, noted the closeness between Stirner's egoism and existential themes. Both emphasize the individual's radical freedom and the absence of inherent meaning or purpose. Both reject essences in favor of existence. Both see the individual as creating their own values rather than discovering them. Yet existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre never cited Stirner, possibly because they were unaware of him, or possibly because acknowledgement would raise uncomfortable questions about influence. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, once warned a small audience about the seducing power of the ego and its own, but never mentioned it in his published work. This pattern repeated constantly. Thinkers encountered Stirner, felt his impact, and then maintained public silence. Rudolf Steiner, Gustav Landauer, Victor Serge, Carl Schmitt, and Jürgen Habermas all read The Ego and Its Own in their youth. None prominently acknowledged its influence in their mature work. This silence is itself significant. It suggests that Stirner's ideas were dangerous, that they threatened established positions, that acknowledging them openly would create problems better avoided. The relationship between Stirner and postmodernism is particularly intriguing. Postmodern philosophy, especially in its French variants, shares Stirner's suspicion of grand narratives, universal truths, and fixed identities. Michel Foucault's genealogical method, which traces how power operates through discourse to constitute subjects, echoes Stirner's analysis of how spooks possess individuals. Jacques Derrida's deconstruction, which reveals how conceptual oppositions depend on suppressed differences, parallels Stirner's exposure of how abstractions dominate consciousness. Yet neither Foucault nor Derrida cited Stirner. The similarity may be coincidental, both thinkers working through post-Hegelian problems and arriving at similar conclusions independently. Or the influence may have been indirect, mediated through other sources. Some scholars argue that Stirner anticipated postmodern critiques of representation and identity by over a century. His concept of the unique one that cannot be captured by language, his insistence that all categories are impositions rather than discoveries, his rejection of any foundation for knowledge or ethics, these positions resonate with postmodern epistemology. The difference is that Stirner arrived at these conclusions through a peculiarly intense application of Hegelian dialectics, while postmodernists developed them through engagements with structuralism, psychoanalysis, and linguistic philosophy. The philosophical contexts differ dramatically, yet the results converge. Stirner's influence on anarchism itself has been contested. Peter Kropotkin, the theorist of anarchist communism, saw Stirnerian egoism as a betrayal of anarchist principles. Anarchism, according to Kropotkin, is about mutual aid, about recognizing that humans are social creatures who thrive through cooperation. Stirner's atomized individualism destroys the possibility of solidarity. reduces human relations to instrumental calculations, and offers no basis for the cooperative society that anarchism envisions. Many social anarchists agreed. They saw Stirner as advocating bourgeois individualism dressed in revolutionary rhetoric, a philosophy that would lead to social Darwinism rather than liberation. Yet other anarchists found Stirner inspiring. The individualist tradition, particularly strong in America and parts of Europe, embraced his rejection of all authority and his insistence on personal autonomy. Emma Goldman, though primarily an anarchist communist, expressed admiration for Stirner's critique of conventional morality and state power. Renzo Novatore, the Italian anarcho-individualist poet, wrote in a style drenched with Stirnerian themes of rebellion and self-assertion. Dora Marsden, the British feminist and individualist, developed a philosophy drawing explicitly on Stirner's concept of ownness. The variety of anarchists claiming Stirner as an influence demonstrates the flexibility, or perhaps the emptiness, of his philosophy. It can be interpreted to support almost any position that rejects conventional authority. The political right has also claimed Stirner at times, a development that would likely have horrified him. Some libertarians and anarcho-capitalists see in Stirner a defense of absolute property rights based on might rather than moral claims. Some revolutionary conservatives, following Ernst Junger's concept of the anarch, interpret Stirner as advocating internal sovereignty rather than collective rebellion. These appropriations typically ignore Stirner's devastating critiques of capitalism, property rights, and economic exploitation. He rejected bourgeois property as thoroughly as he rejected communal property. His egoism was not capitalist individualism. It was something far stranger and more radical that resists incorporation into conventional political categories. Stirner's legacy ultimately consists of a question mark, an unsettling presence that refuses to be assimilated. His book has remained, as Herbert Reed observed, stuck in the gizzard of Western culture. It cannot be digested, cannot be comfortably incorporated into any system. It stands as a permanent challenge to any philosophy that claims authority over the individual, any movement that demands submission to collective purposes, any system that promises meaning beyond individual existence. This is why thinkers who encounter Stirner often prefer silence. To engage him seriously requires confronting the possibility that all our highest commitments, all our values, all our purposes are phantoms we have created and mistaken for reality. The persistence of Stirner's challenge explains why new generations keep rediscovering him. In the 1960s, during the flowering of counterculture and New Left movements, Stirner experienced another revival. Situationists found in him a critique of spectacular society and alienated consciousness. Post-left anarchists saw in him an escape from the orthodox categories of traditional leftism. In the early 21st century, his ideas circulate through online anarchist and nihilist communities, adapted to contemporary context, yet recognizably Stirnerian. Each revival interprets him differently, but all share the recognition that his philosophy poses a question that cannot be evaded. If you could free yourself from all spooks, from all fixed ideas, from all authorities, whether external or internalized, what would remain? Would you discover authentic selfhood or absolute emptiness? Would you find liberation or horror? Stirner's answer is that you would find yourself, the unique one, creating meaning in a world stripped of all comforting illusions. Whether this is a promise or a threat remains disputed. What remains after we have examined Stirner's life, his philosophy, his influences, and his contested legacy? The question is not easily answered because Stirner's work resists synthesis. It is a philosophy that denies the validity of philosophical systems, a critique that undermines even its own foundations, a liberation that offers no destination beyond the act of liberation itself. Yet perhaps this very resistance to closure, this refusal of final answers, constitutes Stirner's most important contribution to thought. The contemporary world would seem to have vindicated many of Stirner's concerns. The modern state has intensified its claims on individual consciousness, wrapping itself in the language of democracy, equality, and justice, while demanding total allegiance. Identity politics, whether of the progressive or reactionary variety, recreates the structure Stirner diagnosed. Individuals subordinating themselves to collective abstractions, finding their meaning in group membership rather than in their unique existence. The multiplication of causes demanding commitment, the proliferation of ideologies claiming truth, the endless cultural battles over proper values and correct thinking. All of these would strike Stirner as variations on the same theme. New spooks have replaced old ones, but the mechanism of possession remains identical. Consider how contemporary discourse functions. Social media platforms amplify the tendency to reduce individuals to categories, to evaluate them based on their adherence to group norms, to punish deviation from collective standards. Political movements on all sides demand purity tests, enforce orthodoxy, and treat disagreement as betrayal. The language of rights, justice, and moral obligation saturates public conversation. Yet these concepts function exactly as Stirner predicted abstractions would. They are phantoms that people have internalized, that shape behavior through guilt and shame, that make individuals sacrifice concrete interests for symbolic victories. The person who posts their outrage about injustice, who performs their virtue for an audience, who finds meaning in their alignment with the right cause. This person is possessed by spooks as surely as any medieval monk haunted by visions of divine judgment. Yet Stirner's philosophy also speaks to another contemporary phenomenon, the widespread sense of meaninglessness, the crisis of purpose that afflicts affluent societies. When traditional sources of meaning, religion, nation, family, work, lose their authority, when individuals are told they are free to choose their own values and create their own meaning, many discover that this freedom is unbearable. The existential crisis that Nietzsche feared, the descent into passive nihilism, has arguably materialized in consumer societies where material abundance coexists with spiritual emptiness. People seek meaning in identity categories, in therapeutic language, in political activism, creating new fixed ideas to fill the void left by the collapse of traditional ones. Stirner would see all of these responses as attempts to escape the burden of ownness, to find security and submission to new abstractions. The question is whether Stirner's egoist offers a genuine alternative or simply a more sophisticated form of despair. If you strip away all spooks, all collective identities, all moral principles, all purposes beyond the self, what remains? Stirner's answer is the unique one, the creative nothing that generates its own meanings. But this is easier to proclaim than to inhabit. Most people, confronted with the vertigo of absolute freedom, the recognition that nothing is inherently meaningful, that all values are self-created, do not experience liberation. They experience terror. This is why Stirner's philosophy has never generated mass movements, why it remains the possession of isolated individuals rather than communities. You cannot organize on the basis of radical individualism. You cannot build solidarity on the principle that each person owes nothing to anyone else. You cannot create a culture that celebrates the destruction of all culture. The paradox of Stirner's legacy is that his ideas have been most influential when misunderstood or partially appropriated. Anarchists took his critique of state authority while ignoring his equal hostility to anarchist principles. Existentialists absorbed his emphasis on individual freedom while retaining commitments to authenticity and responsibility that Stirner would have rejected. Postmodernists echoed his deconstruction of fixed meanings while constructing academic careers and political projects that depend on collective organization. The pure Stirnerian egoist, if such a person exists, leaves no trace in history, forms no alliances, creates no institutions, and therefore cannot influence subsequent thought in conventional ways. This raises a fundamental question about the value of philosophy itself. If Stirner is right, if all universals are phantoms, and only the unique individual exists, then what is the point of philosophical argument? Why write a book articulating these ideas if ideas themselves are spooks that possess consciousness? Stirner seemed aware of this paradox. He insisted that his book was not prescriptive, that he was not telling anyone what to think or do, that he had based his affair on nothing. Yet the very act of writing and publishing the ego and its own contradicts this stance. It is an attempt to change how people think, to liberate them from illusions, to communicate truths about human existence. This performative contradiction runs throughout Stirner's work and has never been adequately resolved. Perhaps the resolution lies in recognizing that Stirner's philosophy is not a doctrine to be believed, but a practice to be attempted. Reading the ego and its own is meant to be a transformative experience, not an intellectual exercise. The book does not convey information about reality, but performs an operation on consciousness. It takes the reader's most cherished beliefs, their deepest commitments, their sense of purpose and meaning, and reveals these as phantoms. The experience of this revelation, if it succeeds, is supposed to free the reader from possession by ideas. But freedom in this sense is not a permanent state. It requires constant vigilance, perpetual skepticism toward one's own thoughts and feelings, an exhausting refusal to settle into any stable identity or conviction. This exhausting character of Stirnerian egoism may explain why even sympathetic readers tend to retreat from its full implications. It is psychologically demanding to live without foundations, without purposes beyond the moment, without any consoling narratives about the meaning of one's life. Most people need some stability, some sense of continuity, some story that makes their actions cohere into a meaningful whole. Stirner offers none of this. He offers only the present moment and the unique one's experience of it, and the recognition that tomorrow's unique one may be entirely different from today's, bound by no promises, no commitments, no obligations to maintain consistency. What then is the lasting significance of Max Stirner? He occupies a unique position in intellectual history. He is not the founder of a school, not the originator of a method, not the prophet of a movement. He is instead a permanent question mark, a challenge that recurs whenever philosophy becomes too comfortable, too systematic, too certain of its foundations. When philosophers construct grand theories about human nature, Stirner whispers that human nature is a phantom. When political movements promise liberation through collective action, Stirner points out that the collective is just another master. When moralists proclaim universal principles, Stirner demonstrates that universality is a conceptual trick that denies the particularity of actual individuals. These challenges cannot be definitively answered because they strike at the roots of philosophical discourse itself. Stirner's philosophy remains as disturbing now as it was in 1844 because it refuses the comfort of answers. It offers no way forward, no program for change, no hope for transformation. It simply clears away illusions and leaves individuals to confront their own existence without mediation, without justification, without purpose, except what they create for themselves in each moment. Whether this is liberation or abandonment, freedom or isolation, honesty or nihilism, depends entirely on the unique one who confronts these questions. And that, ultimately, is Stirner's point. There is no answer that applies to everyone, no truth that transcends individual perspective, no meaning beyond what each person creates. The silence that greeted Stirner's death in 1856, the decades when his work was forgotten, the pattern of influence followed by denial, all of this testifies to the unsettling power of his ideas. They cannot be easily incorporated into existing systems of thought. They cannot be used to build institutions or organize movements. They can only be experienced individually as a challenge to everything we take for granted about ourselves and our world. Perhaps this is why Stirner's legacy is so difficult to trace. It consists not in doctrines passed down through disciples, but in individual moments of recognition, scattered across time and place. When someone reads The Ego and Its Own, and suddenly sees all their sacred beliefs as phantoms, what happens next? What they do with this recognition? Whether they embrace it or flee from it, whether it liberates or destroys them, that is their own affair. Stirner would have it no other way.